Hey, so I'm out, cutting off the dead branches, the dead leaves from my tomato plants. They've been kind of beat up and looking a little bad this summer. But I figured this would be a good time to talk about the verse where Jesus compares himself to the vine. God is the husbandman or the farmer, and we are the branches who are to bear fruit. Now, I've already cut off a lot of dead branches, but as I cut off more, I will talk about this further. Once again, excuse the poor state of my plant. It's been a little beat up when I was gone out of town. But here, so the analogy of what Jesus was saying at that time was this. So God is the farmer who takes care of this plant, right? Jesus is the stem of this plant. I had this better supported and I took it apart for this video. So Jesus is the stem of this plant. We are the branches that are meant to bear fruit. So now, if we do not abide in Jesus, we cannot bear fruit, right? And this is what I don't get about people who claim once saved, always saved, and nothing can take us away. Because the thing is at some point this branch was connected and was feeding off of this, and now it is dead and no longer bearing fruit. Okay? So do you know what God does to that? Clip. Takes it right off, throws it into the fire. So God is tending to the people. Oh, say hello to my puppy. Hi, Jasmine. So God is tending to the people, whether they bear fruit or not, whether they abide in Jesus or not, on whether they inherit the kingdom, whether they go on to be saved. Like this branch might look a little terrible around the edges, but it's bearing fruit, and it's bearing fruit nicely. Same with this one. And I have one here, a sun sugar tomato that's bearing fruit. I already kind of pruned this plant down, like way down. It was a lot worse than this. But you see, that is the Christians who are still abiding in Christ right there. They're bearing fruit for Christ. They're obeying Christ. They're working for Christ. So we can also use this to show that if you are a new believer, you will still be bearing fruit. Even if it's not a lot, you'll still be showing fruit and bearing fruit. God says you will know them by their fruits, right? So, like right here on this plant, it's a still pretty young plant. You can see how it's showing signs of bearing fruit right there. Like that's a little area for it to start bearing fruit here soon. But it's still a pretty young and small plant compared to this one, which is bearing a lot of fruit. So this one's probably would be considered more the mature Christian, right? Or even this one, which is bearing a lot more fruit. So at some point we have to bear fruit though. We have to bear fruit for Christ, or God literally will pick us off and throw us into hell. So one more analogy used in the Bible that we can use in reference to this. So in Matthew 17, it talks about how our faith is like a mustard seed, like a grain of mustard seed. Pay attention to the wording. It does not say the size of a mustard seed. It says like a grain of mustard seed. And why is that so important? Because people believe that with faith like the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. That's not what the verse is talking about. It has to be like a grain of mustard seed. So a mustard seed goes from something very small with no roots in it that can be thrown around by every wind of doctrine, as mentioned in Ephesians, into maturity, which can be grown into a giant tree where the birds nest, which is mentioned in Matthew 13. So our faith has to go from that seed with no roots into something very large where we can take care of others. Those birds nesting are us taking care of others. But also, we are told that if these trees do not bear fruit, they get an axe and they are thrown into hell. So if our faith is not bearing fruit, if we are not obedient, if we are not showing and proving to be ourselves disciples of Jesus, as mentioned in John, then we're still going to get thrown into hell. And remember, it's talking about trees. It's not talking about that mustard seed of faith. It's talking about trees. So when it says the tree does not bear fruit, so that means these people have already matured into some form of a tree, whether it's a young tree or whether it's one nesting or having birds nest and it's like helping people, right, and taking care of others. Then if it chooses no longer to bear fruit, if our faith at that point no longer bears fruit, if we choose to stop obeying God and following his ways, then we can be cut down at the root and cast into the flame. We also have a parable in Luke about the barren fig tree. So in this fig tree, a man goes out and he looks at his fig tree and realizes it's not bearing fruit. So he talks to the vine dresser and he goes, hey, this isn't bearing fruit. And the vine dresser goes, okay, I'll put manure around it. I'll try to get it to come back, but give it a year. And then if it doesn't continue bearing fruit, cut it down. So that shows you, once again, that that tree at one point was grown and bearing fruit. So a mature Christian and bearing fruit, it chose to stop bearing fruit. And God was trying to nurture it back and bring it back into his will, his ways, obedience, right? And was giving it some time because he's a patient God. He gives people time to come back to obedience. He draws them near, he calls them. But if it chooses to continue not to bear fruit, if the person chooses to continue to disobey and not do his will and bear fruit, then it gets cut down. So you guys, these analogies, they're very important for us to know so that we can not only fear God in a healthy way, but we can stay on the straight and narrow path, okay? Because remember, the fear of God is not one of a demonic fear, like what you would get from a horror movie. The fear of God is like the fear you would get when you're speeding and you break the law and you see a cop coming up. You're slowing down really fast because you're afraid that since you're breaking the law that you're going to get in trouble with that cop and get a ticket, right? That cop is there to keep us on the right track. Well, God is there to keep us on the right track. And if we're not obeying him, if we're not following him, then yes, there are going to be consequences. Just like that ticket would be your consequence. That is a healthy fear to keep us on the straight and narrow path. Just remember, the fear of God is not a demonic fear. So when you guys are thinking of these verses, really pick them apart and see what they mean. Think about it. There's a reason why that Jesus spoke in parables and metaphors the way he did, was to help us understand the concepts of the kingdom without any confusion, and yet there still seems to be deception and confusion.